presentation on some murders, mysteries, maybe some setups and cover-ups, some questionable things that happened about 100 years ago in our city. That being said, this is our disclaimer. So while this presentation is for entertainment purposes, we did not change any names, we did not change any locations. While we were doing our research, we maintained the utmost respect for the families, for the victims, and for the cemetery as a whole. We would just ask that you guys do the same. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. Number 1, the Central Viaduct disaster that happened on November 16th, 1895. The Central Viaduct opened in 1888 with the purpose of connecting downtown with the growing west side suburbs. It was a pivot-style bridge with a swing section that allowed taller ships to pass through. The bridge was equipped with a safety gate, red warning lanterns, and a gatehouse shanty. On the evening of November 16, 1895, the bridge opened to allow a tugboat carrying lumber to pass through. It was then that the passengers of streetcar number 642 plunged to their death to the icy waters of Cuyahoga River. The streetcar fell about 100 feet into the river, carrying approximately 21 souls. Over the following 3 days, rescue teams drudged the mucky river and recovered 17 bodies. Among the survivors of the wreck was motorman Augustus Rogers, who, before crashing through the closed safety gate on the bridge, leaped from the streetcar, thus escaping the plummet into the river. Rogers was arrested and charged with manslaughter. He was held for 2 weeks while the incident was investigated, and interviews were conducted with several eyewitnesses. It is often said that there are 3 sides to a story: yours, theirs, and the truth. Rogers knew he was in trouble, so his defense team opted to put the blame on conductor Edward Hoffman, who lost his life that night and would not get the opportunity to tell his side of the story. During Rogers' testimony, he said he was operating on schedule and therefore was not speeding. The speed limit for the bridge was 8 miles per hour, but the city allowed 12. When asked for his exact speed, he could not recall. However, he claimed that conductor Hoffman instructed him to pick up the speed as they approached the bridge to beat the incoming boat that Hoffman saw out in the distance. Rogers also claimed that he wanted to apply the brakes sooner, but Hoffman ordered him not to. He claimed that he could hear the screams and shouts indicating that the bridge was open and that he attempted to apply his brakes at that point, but he was already 25 feet from the edge of the open bridge when the warnings were heard. He was questioned about the presence of the red warning lantern. He never admitted that it was not operational, only that he did not see if the light was there. He could not recall if the safety gate was in fact closed because he had exited the streetcar prior to the crash. At the close of his testimony, he refused to sign the court transcript so as not to incriminate himself. The eyewitness reports suggest everything Rogers claimed was completely inaccurate. The red lantern was lit and visible even in rainy weather of that evening. A gentleman working on the railroad noticed the car picking up speed and screamed to have them stop. The rail worker also estimated that the car was roughly 125 feet from the safety gate when he gave his warning. The shanty worker confirmed that the gate was closed, that the red lantern was functioning, and then the ship captain passing under the bridge also confirmed that all safety features were functioning properly and confirmed that the screaming and shouting could be heard from all directions. After hearing all testimonies, the prosecutor addressed the judge with the request that Rogers be a free man, that Rogers was clearly acting on the orders of the conductor and was simply doing his job. The judge complied. Rogers stood, shook the hands of his friends, which included the prosecutor, and left the room. This story was covered by every newspaper in the country. It was considered the most tragic accident to have occurred. Conductor Hoffman was painted as a negligent man with no regard for the lives that were lost that evening. He left behind his wife and a 1-year-old son and is buried in East Cleveland Township Cemetery. The Cleveland Plain Dealer offered the rough sketches of some of the victims as seen here. It is absolutely possible that other passengers were never recovered if they were without family or friends to report them missing. So tonight, we will remember the 17 named victims who met their untimely death on November 16, 1895, but also let us offer some remembrance for those who may remain unidentified, resting in their eternal grave of the Cuyahoga River. With that, you will see, I'm just going to do a quick plug right here. You can see Monroe Street. Oh, Henry Mecklenburg is buried there. We have a representative from Monroe Street here who would like me to do a quick little plug about Regrow Monroe. If anybody wants any information for that, I have that up here. Monroe Street is our cute little baby sister, and we love her.
The murder of Louis Weck and the trial of Gaetano Pesciata, hopefully my Italian roots got that right. In the early morning hours of December 10th, 1903, shots rang out on what was then 532 Erie Street, now it's East 9th. Concerned citizens woke up, peeking their heads out of their windows and walking out into the frigid Cleveland winter air. It was there that they found Patrolman Louis Weck lying in a pool of red blood snow, gasping for breath. A discarded revolver, still hot, was abandoned beside him, the owner having run off. It wouldn't be long before the attacker of Officer Weck was caught, and what followed was a tragic and wild ride. So that's Louis Weck there in his uniform when he was in the Army. He served in the Spanish-American War. He was a native Clevelander who joined the Army when he was a young man and was a veteran, like I said, of the Spanish-American War. He joined the Cleveland Police Force when he came back, and this photo here is of the Cleveland Police taken in 1902, of just a year before Louis would lose his life. After he was discharged, he married his wife, Augusta Werner, in 1901. They had one child, a little boy named Wilbur. They lived on Holdman Avenue on the east side, and while the street sadly it exists today, the house is gone. Louis Weck was still alive that fateful day when he was rushed to the city infirmary hospital. Doctors did everything they could to try and keep him alive. He had been shot 3 times, but he was still able to give an account to the somber detectives who came to see him of just what had happened. His wife and son, along with his ailing mother Pauline, gathered around his bedside, and as the day wore on, there was some hope that he was going to make it. Sadly, by the next day it was evident that he was not going to pull through. According to the reports, the nurses and doctors were so upset at the sadness and the wailing and crying of his wife and mother and young child that they weren't able to keep their professionalism and they had to leave the room for fear that it would just, be too much. Louis Weck passed on December 12th. The funeral was a grand affair. His coffin was draped in the American flag, and his fellow officers walked alongside his carriage as he made his final journey to Riverside. The question remained, though, who had done this and why? Gaetano Pesciata was an Italian immigrant who had been dancing the night away at the Germanic Hall that fateful morning. As he and his friends walked home, Gaetano, having way too much to drink, started causing a ruckus. According to the dying count of Louis, he had tried to subdue the young man. Since it was so early in the morning, he didn't want to cause a scene. But Gaetano resisted. And according to eyewitness accounts, he reached for his revolver, and that's when he shot Louis Weck 3 times and ran off. Right from the get-go, there was definitely a narrative about the fact that Gaetano was an Italian immigrant. At the time, the U.S. didn't look very kindly. He was definitely labeled as somebody who was not to be trusted, and the fact that he was Italian because he was a member of the Sicilian Secret Society. Yes, we all know. Which, in case you don't know, was another name for the Black Hand. Interestingly enough, they were really invested in trying to get him a good defense attorney. So the mafia put on kind of like a charity, and they raised over $250,000 in today's money to get him a defense attorney. The trial was an absolute circus. Gaetano had to use a court-appointed translator who may or may not have been truthful about what he was translating to the jury. The prosecutors were bent on getting a first-degree murder charge so that they could take him to the chair. The trial even took a crazier turn of events when it was revealed that Gaetano's brother, Mercurio, had been paying off, or attempting to pay off, the jurors. Surprise, surprise. One juror who did take the bribe was Marcus Greenspan. He was found out, and when asked why he would do such a thing, he said, "You know, they have ties to the mafia, and my life is worth more than this country or this county." A whole new jury had to be convened, and the trial concluded with a guilty charge for Pesciata, but thankfully for him, it was only manslaughter. I really couldn't find anything about what happened to Gaetano after this. I couldn't find which jail he was taken to, how long he served, or what happened to him. Louis Weck's name is inscribed on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. If you ever go, it might be worth saying hello to him.
File number 3. This is the murder-suicide of Robert and Janet Farmer, which occurred on October 5th, 1929. So who was Robert Farmer? Robert Farmer was the vice president of the United Mine Workers Union and one of several men in charge of the Lafferty coal mine in Belmont County, Ohio. In the 1920s, miners went on strike, hence Lucy and Ethel, we're revolting, demanding better working and fair wages. Volunteers were brought in to operate and work the coal mines while those in the union picketed outside. Riots often broke out, and the volunteers petitioned the federal government to send troops to protect them from the union workers. Their request was denied based on the claim that the federal government had no jurisdiction over the mines. This proved to be fateful for a man named John Majors. John Majors lived just north of Belmont County in Jefferson County and had a financial interest in the operation of Lafferty coal mine. Therefore, he offered to work during the strike. On July 27, 1922, John Majors, aboard a caravan with others, made its way to the mine and stopped at a crossroad where they were met by Robert Farmer and another man named Dominic Venturau. Farmer warned the caravan that his men were angry and seeking to stop anyone who tried to enter the mine. Reports indicate that an argument had erupted between Farmer, Majors, and Venturau that sparked a riot with 200 people involved. During this argument and riot, a gun was drawn and shots were fired from the direction of Farmer, killing John Majors. Robert Farmer stood on trial for murder. Governor Davis, having served in World War I alongside Farmer, came to the trial and spoke about Farmer's character. Ultimately, Robert Farmer was acquitted of all charges and released, while Venturau served time for murder. Robert returned to life as he knew it in the coal mines. He was often intoxicated, and his craving for liquor led to Janet Farmer's decision to leave him and move to Cleveland. In June of 1929, Janet Farmer filed for divorce. Robert consistently sought to persuade her to return to him, but failed. On October 5th, 1929, Robert made his way to his wife's home in Cleveland to attempt reconciliation again. Robert entered the home, and after failed attempts of reconciliation, he drew his revolver and fired 4 times at his wife. Janet fell to the floor in front of the piano, and Robert walked in front of her, turned the revolver on himself, and fell across her body. Mary, their 20-year-old daughter, heard everything and happened to also witness the suicide of her father. Police officers who happened to be at the corner of the street heard the gunshots and the screams of Mary and swiftly made their way to the residence. Upon arrival, officers found Mary weeping wildly with her body laying across that of her parents. When questioned about the scene, Mary was unable to speak. A green parrot, caged in the corner of the room, screeched loudly at the men in blue as they attempted a line of questioning with hopes that the parrot would talk. In another corner, just a few feet away, a canary sat quietly. So that evening, no one was singing like a canary, not even the canary herself. Janet Farmer was laid to rest a few days later next to their daughter, Janet, who passed away 2 years prior. Robert's body went unclaimed for a few weeks before Thomas, their 27-year-old son, gave the order to have him cremated. 1 month after the murder-suicide, Robert's ashes were placed on the grave of his daughter, Janet. It's a shame that even in death, Mrs. Farmer was unable to escape being near her estranged husband.
The Beador Resort was a vacation hotspot for the affluent of the Rust Belt during the turn of the century. It was situated in Port Huron, Michigan, and it welcomed everybody to come and dine, dance, gamble, boat. It's kind of like Cedar Point, you know? William was the youngest son of Joe Beador, who was the owner of the hotel. Early one morning on July 15th, the young boy was walking behind the hotel where there was a bunch of swampy bulrushes. Imagine the shock and horror that little William felt when he came across the swollen body of a man, his skull crushed in, lying face down in the water. The body was that of a young Jewish cigar maker from Cleveland, Louis Rosenberg. He had been badly beaten and left for dead in the murky, swampy waters surrounding their hotel, where only 24 hours ago he had been partying with his good friends and companions from back home in Cleveland. Samuel Frisbee and Frank Elba were those friends. All three young men were wealthy, upper-middle-class entrepreneurs from Cleveland and had traveled together to spend the weekend enjoying themselves at the hotel. Officers went to their room to let them know what had happened to their friend and maybe see what was going on. They decided to take them in to the police station for questioning. While in police custody, Frank Elbra excused himself into the restroom. When he didn't return, police went in and they found him dying on the floor from a self-inflicted cyanide poisoning. Yeah. Samuel Frisbee, his dear friend, was by his side when he whispered with his dying, "Done it, Sam." With the death of Frank now added to the growing list of corpses that the Port Huron police had to ship back to Cleveland, Sam Frisbee was detained for questioning. The story that Samuel Frisbee told was one of anti-Semitism, greed, and jealousy. Louis, Frank, and Samuel had all been playing cards earlier that fateful night. After downing several drinks and playing just as many rounds of poker, Louis had taken the pot of winnings for the night and gleefully went to the ballroom to celebrate. His two companions were absolutely furious at the loss, with Frank declaring to Samuel, "I'll get that Jew yet." Later that night, Frank and Samuel lured Louis out of the dance hall, promising him that a group of young women down by the lake wanted to spend some time with them. Poor Louis never saw it coming. Frank lunged forward and pistol whipped him in the back of the skull. Louis screamed and ran back docks toward the hotel, but he wasn't fast enough. Frank bludgeoned him again with the butt of his gun, and in the shallow end of the shore, he held Louis's skull underneath the water until he drowned. In his drunken anger, he continued to beat his head in with the end of the gun until Sam, who was supposed to be the voice of reason in this whole thing, supposedly pulled him back. Not knowing what to do, they dragged the body into the rushes, hoping to hide it. The murder of Louis Rosenberg was so heinous that they used a relatively new term for that time period, race hatred. If you look at the middle, Louis's brother said, "If the murder had taken place in Russia, where the Jewish people are persecuted, it would not seem so awful. But to think that race hatred should be the cause of a murder in the United States? What the heck?" After confessing, Samuel Frisbee had tried to take his own life by hanging himself, but he was unsuccessful. Louis's family was determined to bring Samuel to justice, as they felt there was no way that one man, Frank Elbra, could have done that much damage to their son's body. Samuel pleaded not guilty to having taken part in the murder. His father was able to hire him an expensive lawyer, and when the trial came to an end, he was acquitted. Frank Elbra was laid to rest next to his parents. The patch of earth that you see here is where his grave marker should be. His parents were too ashamed of their son and never bought him a headstone. He now lays between his parents, unmarked and almost forgotten by time. Samuel Frisbee went on to live another 7 years after the trial. He married Alma Bannett in 1913 and passed away only 4 years later. He died of indigestion, or so it says on his death certificate. Samuel's father did choose a headstone for his son at Riverside, but it rests quite a few feet apart from him and his wife. Close enough to be buried with, but far enough that it seems kind of cold as the murder that happened that July day.
Okay, this one is a bit of a whirlwind, so buckle up. This is case file number 5, which occurred on November 24th, 1888. This is the quarrel that led to the murder of Handy by Billy Bonesy. Frank Billy Bonesy Morris was a known troublemaker in the Haymarket neighborhood of Cleveland. The Haymarket neighborhood was the area downtown that is now occupied by Tower City, Progressive Field, and the like. It became known for a presence of gangs, violence, and intoxication. Bonesy was described as a hard character who bounced from city to city causing trouble. On November 24th, 1888, Bonesy was drinking at a saloon owned by James Handy. This saloon was on 16 Factory Street, which, based on comparisons between old maps and new maps, is right about at the main entrance of Progressive Field. So next time you go to a baseball game, think about this.
Think about Bonesy.
James Handy was out of the saloon that evening and left his wife in charge. According to Mrs. Handy, Bonesy struck another patron in the face for seemingly no reason at all. Mrs. Handy ordered Bonesy out of the saloon at once. He argued a bit, but then went on his way. Bonesy, having realized he was quite rude to Mrs. Handy, decided to make his way back to the saloon to offer an apology. In the meantime, James Handy had returned to his saloon and learned of the altercation as told by his wife. When Bonesy entered the saloon again, Mr. Handy retrieved a long club from behind the bar and struck him in the head and threw him out the door. Bonesy, still intoxicated and now embarrassed, was seen making his way up Ontario Street saying, "I'll fix him for this." Witnesses say Bonesy entered several pawn shops trying to pawn his trench coat until finally one pawnbroker gave him $3 for the coat. And with that $3, he bought the weapon seen here. James Handy was standing outside the saloon speaking with Carl Wilhelm, the saloon's piano player, when they saw Bonesy running towards them with the revolver drawn and pointed in their direction. A shot was fired and it hit Handy. He turned to run into the saloon to call for help when a second shot was fired and hit him again. Bonesy then took off out of sight. James made his way inside, exclaiming, "I'm shot! Bonesy shot me!" And then he laid himself down on the couch. A patrol wagon was called, as well as for doctors. The patrol wagon arrived first, described Handy as being unnecessarily in intense pain. A patrolman insisted that Handy take a few shots of whiskey so as to take the edge off, but Handy refused. Even being a saloon owner, he never indulged in the activity of drinking. The doctors then arrived and brought Handy to Huron Street Hospital, where they attempted a new surgical operation to save his life. This operation was only discovered about 5 years prior, but was said to help those with blood loss to be able to withstand a lengthy surgical procedure. The operation? Injecting large amounts of saline solution into the bloodstream as a replacement for all of the blood lost. Handy died that evening, 13 agonizing hours later. I know, that gives me goosebumps too. Bonesy escaped the scene and headed west. He was caught in LaGrange a few days later after someone recognized his face from the newspaper. Immediately apprehended by police and brought back to Cleveland, Bonesy was charged with murder and thrown in jail. His trial was a quick one with little investigation done into the incident, and he was sentenced to be hanged for his crime. Bonesy requested a retrial due to the lack of investigation and was granted a second trial immediately. At the second trial, he was convicted still. However, his sentence was reduced to life rather than execution. Bonesy's mother fought for her son to be pardoned and released, saying that he acted solely on self-defense. Each time Bonesy went to the board, Mrs. Handy was present and fought the pardon. Mrs. Handy did this every year until she passed away in 1898, which would have been 10 years later. Bonesy's mother learned of Mrs. Handy's passing and again pleaded with the governor to pardon her son. This time, without Mrs. Handy fighting for her dead husband, the pardon was granted, and in December of 1898, Frank Billy Bonesy Morris walked away a free man.
Apothecary, thy drugs are quick, thus with a kiss I die. This is the tragic death of Forrest Noble Dean and the suicide of his wife, Gladys Ruth Dean. At the dawn of the new year, on a cold and bleak January 1st, 1901, Forrest Dean took his last breath. He was a young man, barely 18, who had fallen ill for weeks and had suffered with the absolute misery that was typhoid fever. He stood no chance in a time when antibiotics weren't even a thing yet. His family and friends mourned his passing, a life so young and so full of promise, gone in an instant, it seemed. What they didn't know is that Forrest's death, along with his, another bright soul, was soon to be snuffed out, as if by the hands of typhoid itself. Gladys Ruth had been a dear friend of the Dean family for almost all her life. She had grown up with Forrest and his brothers and sisters, and both families were on friendly terms with each other. At first, it was expected that Gladys was so distraught over her childhood friend passing. After all, they had always been fond of each other. But a few months after his burial, Gladys had not recovered from her grief. In fact, every day, she would make the journey to his graveside at Riverside Cemetery and spend hours there weeping over him. No one knew why, and if they did, they kept it a secret. In June of that very year, Gladys left her job early, claiming she didn't feel well. But instead of going right home, she went to the local pharmacy and tried to get a prescription for carbolic acid. Something in her demeanor must have tipped off the pharmacist because he refused to sell it to her. Without a word, Gladys went home, rummaged through her mother's cleaning products, because that's what carbolic acid was used for at the time, and found half a used bottle. Penning a quick note to her mother, she slipped out of the house undetected by her family, and she walked down the road to Riverside. By the time she was noticed missing, it had been hours. Her family and friends had been searching all night. It wasn't until the morning that her father found her, lying prone over Forrest's grave, the poison bottle still in her hand. She was barely clinging to life when they took her into the house of the groundskeeper. But it was too late. Gladys was just 18 years old, and she had taken her own life. But why? The question had to be answered, and it would be answered later on by her sister. Barely a year earlier, in August, the two young lovers, Forrest and Gladys, had married in secret. The two had been courting for years unbeknownst to their families, and it was that young love and devotion and passion that caused them to wed. No one except the sisters of Gladys knew of the marriage, and when it was revealed, they found a marriage certificate and a ring amongst her stuff. Both families were stunned at the revelation and were really confused because they had always been very fond of each other. Forrest was like a son to them. No one, not even the sister, knew why the secrecy was so important to them. They both took that to their graves. In the end, once it was revealed that Gladys and Forrest had in fact been married, the Dean family wanted to give her the support and respect that she would have received in life had they known that she was the wife of their son. The Roofs agreed that they both should be together in death, since their time together in life had been so fleeting. Gladys now rests in the Dean plot, next to the place in which she ended her grief and went to be with her young husband. For never was there a tale of more than this of Juliet and her Romeo.
Case file number 7. As a little bit of a backstory, Luke Sr. is actually the reason that we decided we should make a whole series about murders, mysteries, and unusual things that happened at the cemetery. Because I had been researching for a different tour and came across something that bothered me like no other. You'll see why in a minute. Luke Sr. was a founding partner of Beckman Sr. and Company and got his start in the woolen industry with his brother, J.H. Sr., and partner, F. Mulhauser, in the firm of L. and J.H. Sr. and Company. Due to several disagreements between the partners, Luke withdrew from the company in 1882, and the company changed names then to F. Mulhauser and Company. Luke began a new partnership with Herman Beckman, and together they formed the Beckman Sr. and Company. The business was extremely successful, and after about 6 months of operation, Beckman and Mulhauser agreed to join together under yet another new name, the Northern Ohio Blanket Mills. Luke Sr. was made superintendent of this new business and was to be paid an annual salary of $2,400 plus 15% of the net profits. Having a history with Luke Sr., Mr. Mulhauser made it known to Beckman that Sr. was terrible at keeping finances and would surely force the business to the ground. In August of 1887, a suit was brought against Mulhauser by Sr. requesting to be paid the salary that he was owed from the last 5 years. A counterclaim was made by Mulhauser, stating that they withheld pay because Sr. had taken upwards of $100,000 in wool and supplies. Judge Lamson heard the claims and asked Mulhauser, "Why didn't you approach Sr. about this before now?" To which he responded, "Mr. Sr. has trouble with aggravation, and we felt it was best to leave the situation alone." He continued on with a claim that he questioned Sr.'s sanity, offering examples of why he felt this way. Having heard these claims, the judge ruled in favor of Mulhauser. And this was the beginning of the end for Mr. Sr. Beckman, not wishing to be in business with a man whose sanity was in question, sought to buy Luke out of his share of the business. The newspapers had headlines that smeared Sr.'s name and offered sympathy to his vulnerable business partner. Luke refused to sell and in turn requested that Beckman allow him to buy his shares instead. Again, the newspaper wrote about Senior's erratic and bold business moves with continued sympathy for Beckman. Then, in 1890, Beckman heard from a source that Luke was boasting about having the funds to pay $150,000 and was going to buy Beckman's half. This worried Beckman, which prompted his request that Luke's mental impairment be decided by the court. During the trial, Luke had his integrity questioned, as well as his inability to control his finances. Called to testify as a witness to Luke's spending and abnormal actions was none other than our wayward streetcar motorman, Augustus Rogers. That's what I said.
All coming together.
Rogers claimed that Senior spoke to him about the money to acquire the blanket mills. He also recounted the number of horses Luke purchased, the purchase of a farm, a second resident from Samuel Sessions, a commissioned sculpture to Senior's liking, and spoke about his hot temper. Senior interrupted Rogers, saying, "I was never hot. I was always perfectly cool. I'm as cool now as any man in the room." Rogers continued, with sorrow in his voice, "Mr. Senior was one of the best and one of the most industrious men I ever knew. It's a shame what's happening to him." With that, Senior jumped from his seat and exclaimed, "I dispute you, sir! I dispute your words!" Rogers completed his testimony and returned to his seat beside Luke Sr. The judge addressed Senior and asked for an explanation for everything. Luke explained that he worked very hard for all that he had. He worked 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. He deserved what he had just as much as any other man deserves what they work for. Luke said, "I have never done a dishonest or mean act, nor have I ever wronged a fellow man. I have fed the hungry, I have clothed the naked, I have housed the orphan. To my child and to everyone, I have done nothing to be ashamed of. Am I extravagant in my spending? Yes. Does that make me crazy? I should think not." Having heard Luke's plea, would you think that the judge showed some compassion? No. Instead, he replied, "Mr. Senior, you have exclaimed that you do not have a hot temper, but today you stand here hot and pounding your fists against the table. Of course I am hot today. I am forced to demand my spending. Look at my books, Judge. They are as clean and balanced as ever. I would never engage in spending that might embarrass my daughter." Having heard enough from Senior, the judge requested that the findings be read from the physicians who examined him. The physicians were not present at the time of the hearing, so the report was read by Senior's attorney. From the report, his manner did not indicate mental trouble. As to what he said, there is nothing in it to lead one to believe him insane, unless it were to be proven otherwise. To me, isn't that your job? The report continues by mentioning Luke as a nervous man, elegant in stature, and concerned heavily about his daughter Annie, and how all of this might affect her. The report mentioned that the relationship between Luke and Annie may have indicated that they were unusually close, that she thought the world of him. It was because of this that the judge refused to accept any testimony of Annie's sanity trial, in fear that her biased opinion of her father may cloud the judgment of those involved. But they let Augustus Rogers, okay. I don't get it. The report indicated that no one singular act would prove someone to be insane. But the knowledge of all of Luke's actions together, coupled with any relevant background information offered by his business partners, may result in a judgment of insanity. The doctors also made mention that Luke necessary physical tests without any trouble or irritation. At the completion of the report, the judge found Luke Sr. to be insane. Luke again stood and protested. He said, "The physician said I am perfectly well." The judge responded, "You did not understand the testimony, I'm afraid. While they said you were physically well, he did indicate that insanity could be considered when compiling all known information. So with that, Mr. Senior, I will give you two options. You may go quietly in the care of Augustus Rogers, who will ensure that you are properly treated, or you will be taken by force to the asylum. Again, Senior protested. At this point, Rogers leaned over, whispered Senior, and after a brief pause, Senior agreed to leave with Rogers. Unfortunately, Rogers turned him into the asylum anyway, claiming maybe his brain has some inflammation on it. He's not well and he needs to be in the care of the asylum. After less than a month in the asylum, Senior managed to escape with another patient. Unfortunately, he didn't make it far before he was discovered hiding in the bedroom of his old friend's house. When the bedroom door was kicked in, Luke was seen clinging for his life to the bedpost. He begged to be left alone and not taken back. His cries were heard by the crowd at the house, and they all watched as Luke was removed from the home in restraints. Luke's health was declining rapidly, and at the request of his daughter Annie, the doctors released Luke into her care. She hoped that a trip out to California to see extended family would lift his spirits. So, they boarded a train and headed west. The pair weren't in California for more than 24 hours before returning to Ohio. News had traveled out west, and the extended family was embarrassed by their association with him and declined his request to stay with them. Now remember, this is the 1800s. This is by railway. They didn't take a plane and get out there in a couple hours. The railway went the whole way there, said, nope, sorry, you can't come in, and then sent themselves back. Their arrival back to Cleveland was met with another court order to appear before the judge. Just before Luke and Annie had left for California, Samuel Sessions met with Annie and requested that the agreement made by Luke with Sessions to purchase Samuel's property be canceled. He offered her the refund of the deposit Luke had made, and in turn, she handed him the written contract. This should have been the end of the exchange. However, Samuel Sessions was fearful that if the title to the house, which never was turned over to Luke, had not been cleared of Senior's name by the court, he may never recover. No judge should have picked up this case. But guess who did? Judge Lamson. Being Sessions' brother-in-law, he decided that he should hear the case. Of course, Judge Lamson ruled in Sessions' favor, which again put Luke's name in headline. Next came the request from one J.G.C. Hamilton to have the sculpture made in Luke Sr.'s likeness returned to him. That's what that is right there. And I just want to pause for a second and explain something. This is Luke Sr.'s monument at Riverside Cemetery. What you'll notice is up at the top, a very unusual, almost unfinished flat spot. Maria and I had often wondered, was it an urn that was there before? Maybe a sphere? What was up there before that clearly looked like it was missing? J.G.C. Hamilton was just kind of starting his career. He had made the sculpture of Moses Cleveland that is downtown, and he was afraid that since Luke Sr.'s statue had his mark on it, that they may associate him with the insane man and tarnish his prestigious reputation. Annie pleaded with Hamilton, explaining that the sculpture belongs atop her father's recently placed monument at Riverside Cemetery, and without it, his monument may appear unfinished. Guess who heard that case? Judge Lamson! speculation, but the Lamson and Sessions Monument, if you have not been to Riverside, you should see it maybe, but it made newspaper headlines because it was $10,000 purchased in 1880, made of marble and shipped from the East Coast to Ohio, where it was placed. Everyone knew about it, everyone came to look at it. If something like that were in the same cemetery, only a few years later, maybe they would look at this one instead. In fear of a monument that might outshine his own, and again, that's speculation, he ruled in favor of Hamilton. Now, I have tried to find out what happened. I know that Hamilton did not smash it right away because in 1894, he entered it into a sculptor's contest and won. When I tell you my blood was boiling,
We want to find it.
so I'm looking for it. And if I find it, you best believe I'm going to go in all black, I'm stealing it, like, I don't know, 007 style, and I'm putting it where it belongs.
In Riverside.
Yes. Annie, having gone through the most troubled year of her life, requested that Luke's brother in Philadelphia take pity upon them and allow her and her father to come stay with them. Agreeing to this, Annie and her father made their way to Philadelphia, but the hope of his health recovering never happened. In 1892, at the very young age of 49 years old, Luke Sr. passed away from heart trouble. His name was never cleared, and there is almost no credit given to him in regard to the success of the Northern Ohio blanket mills, which lasted 150 years of business. He didn't get a grand funeral to celebrate his accomplishments. He didn't have visitors weeping over his grave. And today, his monument stands unfinished, almost as a symbol of the life unfinished by Luke Sr. himself. I know!
This next story, I'm just retelling it the way that the newspapers of the time did, and respect that they gave them then was like goose egg. If I sound a little bit more lighthearted with this, that's why. Keeping up with the Davies, the toxic and explosive marriage and death of George and Hannah Davies. We often have this idea that way back when, people acted with a sense of propriety and decorum. Our great-grandparents seemed like austere pillars of all things proper and would never have aired their dirty laundry for all the world to see. That very much might have been the case for some, and really, what would our ancestors have thought of things like social media? Us following people both infamous and famous, wanting to see what they're gonna do next, get all the juicy gossip? They would be appalled, right? Well, maybe not as much as we think. When I started looking into the story of George Davies and his wife Hannah, I suddenly found myself like down a rabbit hole of just the most insane chain of events that you are about to hear. News article after news article titled with the most salacious headlines about the Davies family was an absolute whirlwind. This is the only two pictures of these people that exist. This is George Davies, the victim, and that's the only picture of his wife Hannah that I could, super flattering. So where should I begin? I had to do a timeline of it because keeping track of this lunacy was a lot. So George and Hannah Davies met in London in about 1869. Not much is known about their early life other than that George was a commission merchant, meaning he kind of helped bring in like fruits and vegetables and different things, and that Hannah had supposedly come from very humble beginnings. They moved to America, settled in Cleveland, and started a family soon after. As far as I can tell, everything was quiet with them for years, until one day, George Davies filed an inquest to have his wife examined for lunacy. The newspaper reported that while she didn't totally seem insane, if she kept it up, she really was going to lose her marbles. Barely a month later, Hannah files for divorce and threatens to kidnap their youngest child, have their oldest daughter, Rose, arrested for insanity, and to carry off all their furniture and belongings. So George gets a restraining order. In May, George was back in court asking that Hannah be arrested for violation of the restraining order. She broke into their home while he was away, tried to kill their daughter, Rose, and then ordered their maid, Mrs. Clark, out of the house, told her she was fired. She refused to let poor Mrs. Clark, the maid, gather her things, and instead she ran off with the servants' pillows. The pillows were later recovered by the police and returned to the poor woman. No charges were filed. In June, things escalated again when, in the divorce hearing, the daughter Rose spoke on how her mother had been mistreating her for years, accusing her of incest with her father, and wanted to send her to the workhouse. Hannah, of course, denied everything. In June, she filed for a counterclaim that George had not only defamed her character, but had also assaulted her, kidnapped their youngest son back. No proof was given in any of these accusations brought forward. Everything was dropped, and they resumed their marriage. Part 2. The following December, Hannah filed for divorce again, claiming that in years prior, George had beat her just a few days before she had given birth to their last child. Now, mind you, this was in 1894. She's talking about something that supposedly happened back in 1888. She said that he beat her because she wouldn't sign over property to him, nor would he to dispose of the household furniture the way she saw fit. These people were really obsessed with their furniture. I can't tell you how many times it was mentioned in all of the articles that I did research on. It was a very big bone of contention. After another very public court case, the charges were dropped again. A few months later, in March, the second oldest daughter, Florence, was compelled to testify in a hearing about lunacy for her older sister, Rose. Hannah was still hell-bent on getting her daughter locked away, and she forced Florence to speak on how her sister would throw herself around the house, screaming, throwing chairs at her mother, tossing plates at the rest of the family. She also attempted to fight their neighbor and was quoted saying, "If you want to fight, bring the gloves and get someone to count the rounds." The end of the article sums that the last few years with the Davies family, other incidents over the years show that the dove of peace did not hover over the household at all times. So for 2 more years, everything was silent. No salacious stories printed, no wild incidents, nothing. Until one winter morning in February. Winters are bad in Cleveland. It all came to a head. On a cold winter morning, is anybody surprised? On a cold winter morning in February, the quiet of Grace Street, where the Davies lived, was broken by a young woman screaming for help. When the neighbors heard that the call was coming from the Davies home, they rolled their eyes. This wasn't their first time hearing a bunch of ruckus coming from that house. But when the screams wouldn't stop, a few of the men went to investigate. What they found was a hysterical Florence Davies kneeling in the frigid snow of her yard, wailing that her father was dead and that her mother had done it. When the police entered the home, they found George Davies sitting at his breakfast table, half his skull blown off, blood everywhere, and not a single trace of Hannah. No manhunt was necessary, though, because Hannah had walked herself down to the police station, calmly handed them the pistol, and said, "I have killed my husband and I am here to turn myself in." Across town, Florence, their daughter, was recounting what should have been an ordinary morning to the detectives. She said her parents had been arguing, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They always argued. When Florence walked away to give them some privacy to bicker, she went to her room. The voices escalated, and she heard her mother stomping up the stairs, rummaging through her room, and then going back down. A few moments later, the lull was broke by a loud bang. When Florence went down to find out if everything was okay, she found her mother gone. When she went to check on George, she found him in the state the police did and ran outside screaming. So what was the final straw that made Hannah Davies kill the man that she had been quarreling with for the better part of a decade? According to the disjointed statement she gave to her lawyer, George had called her a harlot that morning and slung verbal abuse at her for the last time. She had had enough and wanted to put an end to their feud once and for all. Hannah Davies was charged with manslaughter and would face a jury that summer. The woman that had stood in the courtroom was a husk of the once fiery subject of the Cleveland gossip columns. She wept and she wailed and claimed that her husband and children's cruelty towards her had caused her to be pushed over the edge. Miracle on her part, Hannah was acquitted of manslaughter. But was committed to the hospital for psychiatric care. I couldn't find a single thing about what happened to her after that. But she lived out the rest of her years in Cleveland and died of heart disease at the age of 87 in 1935. This large open plot at Riverside is the resting place for the various members of the Davies family, including George and his wife Hannah. They were buried side by side. Their poor children are not buried there, and there are no markers there for them. It's literally a giant open plot. So like most of the people that we've talked about this evening, they exist in the fading memories of the families who loved them or who were wronged by them. And now you are all carriers of their stories. For the briefest moment in time, their names are spoken and their stories are told. You will know that they were once here. We hope that when you visit Riverside, you can feel them through the quiet of the stones, the patches of the grass, and the passage of time.